Welcome everybody to the water quality standards portion of the summit. Um, and welcome from sunny, crisp, cool Dallas, Texas. Uh, my name is Mike Schaub. I'm a member of the water quality standards team here in Region 6. Um, our goal this morning is to introduce water quality standards to folks, assuming that most of the folks in the audience are new to it, or at least new to some parts of it. And we really are going to be kind of starting from the beginning, kind of like a 101 level survey course. Um, so we're not going to be getting into a whole lot of detail or other uh, real specific, case specific situations. Along the way, we have included some blank slides between different parts of our presentation where my colleagues and I can answer questions from the chat boxes, everywhere from 10 to 15 or 20 minutes, depending how long each presentation part takes. And we'll hopefully do a question or two at those break points. Then we'll hopefully have some time at the end of the seminar for more questions if there are any. We can answer basic questions, but if you have more detailed or advanced or case specific questions or questions specific to a situation that you're dealing with there, we would be happy to visit in a separate conversation. We ask that you please enter questions in the chat box at any time with assistance from Karen and Chelsea at iTech. We will be keeping track of these questions and pose them to presenters at the different break points. At that time, I may combine some questions or change the order from the chat box just for maintaining the flow of information. And also, we may decide to hold some questions for a later break if they pertain to information later in the presentation. And as always, if we don't get to all questions today, we'll certainly follow up outside of the presentation. So with that, here is just a list of contacts, folks on the water quality standards team that you'll be hearing from today. Diane Evans, Jasmine, Russell, myself, Forrest John, and Richard Wooster is our chief of the Water Quality Protection Section in Region 6. I don't know if Richard is on the call today or not, but he is our supervisor. I want to go through some disclaimers before we get going. This presentation does not impose any binding requirements. It does not determine the obligations of the regulated community. It does not change or substitute for any statutory provision or regulation requirement. It does not represent, change, or substitute for any agency policy or guidance. And it does not control, in any case, of conflict between this discussion and statute, regulation, policy, or guidance. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the views or policies of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, but I think there's been a number of authors, both here and at EPA headquarters, that have put this presentation together. I think it's hopefully will him pretty close to that. And so, and just an overview, we're going to cover the history of the Clean Water Act, talk about some of the laws, regulations, and guidance related to water quality standards. We're going to get into the standards themselves, the core components, the three-legged stool, if you will, for water quality standards, including designated uses, water quality criteria, and anti-degradation. Talk briefly about some additional components of standards, and then talk about some of the roles of authorized tribes, states, territories, the public, and EPA, and then how water quality standards can be actually implemented in water quality management programs. So with that, I'm going to now turn the presentation over to Jasmine Diaz Lopez. And allow her to cover the first part. Jasmine?
Thank you, Mike. Good morning, everyone. Like Mike said, we'll start with at the legal basis for a water quality standards program, the Clean Water Act. Next slide. So congressional statutes have mentioned water back as early as the 1800s. For example, the Rivers and Harbors Act, which focused on protecting navigation routes. The Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which was enacted in 1948, is the root of the modern Clean Water Act because it focused on protection for water quality, not only for navigation. In 1972, the Act was amended to add many of the key programs we are familiar with today, and we call the 1972 and subsequent versions of the statute the Clean Water Act. The modern Clean Water Act includes some changes along the way. For example, the construction grants added in 1972 were placed in 1987 by the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. Next slide. Next. The 1972 amendments were critical to establishing the modern Clean Water Act because they provided a robust structure and some major requirements that enhance the legal mechanisms for protecting clean water. At the 50,000-foot level, some of the most major additions were that it established the basic structure for regulating pollutants discharged into waters of the U.S. It also made it unlawful for any person to discharge any pollutant from a point source into navigable waters, unless, of course, a permit was obtained under its provisions. It also funded the construction of sewage treatment plants under construction grant programs. It also required each state to adopt water quality standards for all interstate and intrastate waters, and provided for EPA review and approval or disapproval. This is the aspect we will be talking about most about today. And finally, it provided opportunities for meaningful public engagement. Next slide. In 1987, Congress amended the Clean Water Act in part by adding Section 518, authorizing the EPA administrator to treat tribes in a similar manner as states, or TAS, for purposes of administering certain Clean Water Act programs, as long as the tribes can meet certain eligibility criteria. These programs include 303C, Water Quality Standards, 401 Water Quality Certifications, 303D Impaired Water Listings and TMDLs, 402 NPDES permits, 404 Dredge or Fill permits, and 106 and 319 grants. Under Clean Water Act Section 518E, EPA can authorize tribes to establish water quality standards to protect waters under their jurisdiction. We make use of the words tribes in this presentation, recognizing that some identify themselves as bands, nations, rancherias, communities, pueblos, colonies, towns, Indians, Aboriginal names, and villages. EPA tries to respect the tribe's identity whenever we can, but the federal government has settled on tribes as generic terms. Note that authorized tribe refers to tribe that has a TAS for the Water Quality Standards Program. We'll use this term throughout this presentation. Next slide. In less than 50 years, the Clean Water Act has had a big impact on improving and protecting our nation's water quality, but people may not be aware of how big its impact has been. You may be familiar with the Cuyahoga River, the river that caught fire, located in northeast Ohio. At one time, the Cuyahoga River was one of the most polluted rivers in the United States, and the reach from Akron to Cleveland was completely devoid of fish. At least 13 fires were reported on the Cuyahoga River, the first occurring in 1868 and the largest in 1952, which burned for 3 days and was reported to cause over $1.5 million in damage. Then in 1969, a river fire captured the attention of Time magazine, which described the Cuyahoga River as the river that oozes rather than flows. The impairment of this river helped to spur the environmental movement. In the late 1960s, And it's one of the reasons that we have the Clean Water Act, which intended to help prevent impairments of our waters. The picture on the right shows the Cuyahoga River today. What happened between the days when the river was burning and oozing and now? Well, several things. First, the Clean Water Act and EPA regulations implementing the act were put into place. The federal EPA and the Ohio EPA were also created. All of these, along with public involvement, brought a lot more attention to sources of pollution to the river, and work began to remedy the problems. Although the river today still faces environmental challenges, it has been restored in many aspects. It flows again, it doesn't catch fire, it contains fish and other aquatic life, and it even attracts kayakers. While this is an extreme case showing the benefits of the Clean Water Act, the Act and its implementation regulations can still have an effect in today's waters. For example, having tribal water quality standards as part of tribal laws gives greater control in determining how waters are protected and in defining the goals for restoration of degraded waters. Water quality standards are also important in overall efforts to prevent or minimize communities' exposure to pollutants and harmful substances. Because water quality standards set the foundation for what level of water quality must be met by other clean water programs, they provide opportunities for ensuring water quality protection in areas used by sensitive and environmentally overburdened populations. Next slide. We will now talk about the basic legal framework of how the Clean Water Act gets implemented through EPA programs, specifically the Water Quality Standards Regulation. What people may not know is that the passing of a law like the Clean Water Act is just the beginning of addressing problems like water pollution from federal level. Next slide. The Clean Water Act is a law or a statute passed by Congress that imposes requirements. Everything that EPA requires in its regulations under the Clean Water Act must derive from the law. A statute or law is enacted by Congress, it's a must. Statutes are typically signed by the president, but in some cases, such as the Clean Water Act amendments of 1972, if the president vetoes a statute, Congress can get enough votes to override the veto for it to become a law. Regulations under the Clean Water Act are promulgated by EPA. They are also must, and they implement the law. This presentation will go over many different regulations written and administered by EPA that are designed to implement the Clean Water Act. We'll start talking about water quality standards, and we'll also talk about National Pollutant Discharge Elimination Systems, or NPDES permits, and total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, as well as other implementation programs. To develop and promulgate regulations, agencies use a process called notice and comment rulemaking, which is itself governed by law. These regulations provide detail on the Clean Water Act requirements, but often EPA also publishes guidance and policy documents that provide more detail to assist states and authorized tribes in implementation. EPA's guidance and policy are different. They are the EPA's recommendations on how to implement regulations. They do not and should not create a binding norm and cannot limit the agency's action in a particular instance. Guidance and policy are not basis for disapproval of water quality standards. EPA can use a guidance as proxy rulemaking. Guidance and policy are a should and not a must. Examples of a guidance and policy in water quality standards can be found in the Water Quality Standards Handbook. To summarize, laws are the overarching framework of requirements. Regulations are more specific requirements that flesh out the laws. And guidance and policy are recommendations to help facilitate the implementation of laws and regulations. Guidance and/or policy are made by EPA to help states and authorized tribes follow the regulations and/or law. Now let's look more closely at each of these elements in the hierarchy, starting with the basics of the Clean Water Act. Next slide. In the Clean Water Act, Congress tells us the objective of this act is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. That's a great objective, and ultimately what water quality standards are all about. But it's a little hard to wrap a water quality management program around the broad objective. Fortunately, the Clean Water Act, Section 101A2, provided some more nuance to that and established that it is the national goal that wherever attainable, an interim goal of water quality which provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water, be achieved by July 1st, 1983. You will hear these phrases and these section numbers many times in your work on the Water Quality Standards Program. So if you haven't memorized them already, you probably will eventually. EPA's Water Quality Standards regulation provides further detail on what the Clean Water Act interim goal means and how authorized tribes Water Quality Standards Program aim for the interim goal and the main objective of the restoration and maintenance of the nation's water. We will get more into EPA's Water Quality Standards regulation shortly, as it is the core of the implementing regulations for the Act. Next slide. Before we get more into the Clean Water Act and its implementation programs to protect water quality, we need to know what we are talking about when we talk about waters protected under the Clean Water Act. And beyond that, what impacts on waters are we talking about? The Clean Water Act applies to navigable waters, which the Act further defines as waters of the United States, and has been defined in regulations since the early 1970s. A broad range of waters may meet the term of regulatory definition. These include certain rivers, streams, lakes, natural ponds, wetlands, and marine waters. Marine waters include estuaries such as bays, salt marshes, lagoons, and nearshore coastal waters. This slide shows a very broad brush overview, but keep in mind that this is a controversial topic, so we won't go into any more detail today. Questions about what is included in the definition of waters have been litigated numerous times up to the Supreme Court, and EPA and the Army Corps has been spent years working on regulations to better define it. The definition of waters of the United States does not include groundwater and never has. Some states and tribes may have water quality standards for groundwater, but such standards do not fall within the scope of the federally mandated Water Quality Standards Program. Therefore, if a state or tribe were to submit such standards, it's important to know EPA does not have the Clean Water Act authority to approve or disapprove water quality standards for groundwater. However, the Safe Drinking Water Act provides protections for underground sources of drinking water. The Biden-Harris administration identified the Navigable Waters Protection Rule for review under Executive Order 13990. The EPA will follow the science and law in accordance with executive orders and other directives in reviewing all of the agency's issues under the previous administration to ensure that they protect public and health and the environment. Next slide. Here are some key sections of Clean Water Act that outline some of the major implementation programs. The first number of the section indicates the title of the act in which the section is located. For example, 303 is Section 303 is part of Title III of the Act. Section 101 outlines the major goals as we just saw a couple slides ago. Section 502 has definitions that apply throughout the Act. Section 303 outlines the requirements for water quality standards and provides the basis for EPA's water quality standards regulation at 40 CFR Part 131. Section 402 outlines the requirements for point source permitting under National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, and 301 and 302 are related to developing effluent limits for such permits. Section 319 talks about management for non-point source pollution. That is pollution not managed under Clean Water Act permits. It tasks states and authorized tribes to develop management plans and EPA to award grants for that management. The Clean Water Act does not provide direct regulatory authority over non-point sources of pollution. Finally, sections 401, 510, and 518 talk more about the roles of states and of tribes, which are somewhat different. Next slide. What activities are regulated under the Clean Water Act? The Clean Water Act provides for regulation of activities related to point source discharges. The Clean Water Act defines a point source as any discernible, confined, and discrete conveyance, including but not limited to any pipe, ditch, channel, tunnel, conduit, well, discrete fissure, container, rolling stock, concentrated animal feeding operation, or vessel or other floating craft from which pollutants are or may be discharged. Some examples of activities that have point source discharges can affect water quality or NPDES permits to discharge pollutants from a point source into the waters of the U.S. This type of discharge and the NPDES permitting process for it are discussed in Section 4.2 of the Clean Water Act. Point sources discharge include discharges from publicly owned treatment works, or POTWs for short, industrial wastewaters, stormwater runoff through a sewer system, and concentrated animal feeding operations. Non-point source pollution is any source of water pollution that does not meet the legal definition of point source in Clean Water Act Section 402. Essentially, non-point source pollution is something that does not come out of the discrete conveyance like a pipe, channel, etc. Some point source pollution often cannot be tied to a single source. It occurs when rainfall, snowmelt, or irrigation runs over land or through the ground, picks up pollutants and deposits them into rivers, lakes, or the ocean. It is well documented that these pollutants can have harmful effects on drinking water supplies, recreation, fisheries, and wildlife. Although the relative impact from few non-point sources might be small, the cumulative impact from many non-point sources degrades water quality. The Act does not regulate non-point sources of pollution, but to address non-point sources, the 1987 amendments to the Clean Water Act established the Section 319 Non-Point Source Management Program. Next slide. The Clean Water Act outlines two different but completely complementary types of protection. We have technology-based and water quality-based. The technology-based approach focuses on what each type of discharger can achieve for specific pollutants based on the performance of treatment and control technologies, and does not look at the impacts of those pollutants on receiving waters. Permit writers calculate the technology-based effluent limits, or TBELs, for dischargers. TBELs are derived from effluent guidelines that serve as national standards for wastewater discharges to surface waters and publicly owned treatment works. These federal effluent guidelines are for regulating different types of industries and provide the performance standards they must meet. To calculate the tech-based limits, you can look up those numbers in the CFR. You can think of TBELs as intended to level the playing field across the country so that the same end of pipeline limits are expected from the same industrial groups, and you won't end up with some states allowing less stringency and becoming de facto pollution havens. The water quality-based approach focuses on meeting limits based on what is needed to achieve water quality standards that apply to the ambient receiving water and are derived in a case-by-case basis. Under the water quality approach, we calculate water quality-based effluent limits, or WQBELs, for discharge permits. WQBELs are derived from water quality standards, which are applied to the water body. But the boiled-down version for these two approaches is that for permitting discharges or pollutants waters of the U.S., you need to meet the more stringent of the tech-based or water quality-based approach. Permit writers calculate what limits would be placed on a facility to meet each of these. Ultimately, the more stringent of the two ends up being the one that the permitting needs to meet. Under the Clean Water Act, the EPA issues permits for discharges to waters in Indian country. That is because no tribes have TAS to administer NPDES programs at this point in time. For the rest of this presentation, we'll focus on the water quality-based approach, but I wanted to make sure that you were aware that the Clean Water Act set up this two-approach system. I will now turn it back to Mike for any questions on this section of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jasmine. And I'm looking at our chat box here, and I'm not seeing any questions. Chelsea, if you receive something in a different way.
Yeah. I have one question, that's it. And it's asking if they will have access to this PowerPoint. So is that something you guys are going to be okay with sharing after the fact?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Other than that, that's the only question I have. So I say
Okay.
let's, oh wait, hold on. Here's one more that I've got.
Okay.
Tribes that don't have TAS are expected to have their own standards, question mark.
That is a question that we're going to address, I believe, at the very end of our presentation that and Diane's going to talk about the roles of tribes in the water quality standards process. And Diane, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is going to be covered later, correct?
Sure, we'll circle back to that then. Thank you.
Yep. Okay.
Perfect. All right, then let's move forward.
Okay. Well, Russell, Mr. Nelson, you're on the clock, sir.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Russell Nelson. As you heard, I'm the Regional Standards Coordinator here at Region 6. And I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about some of the things that Jasmine talked on. You'll hear some of the terms that she used and some of the definitions a second time. But, you know, since she's given a really good overview of the Clean Water Act, I'm going to provide a little bit of the statutory basis for water quality standards and describe just exactly what's in them. As you can see here on this slide, you know, the Clean Water Act sets out the expectations for water quality standards in Section 303C, as Jasmine said. It's important to understand that your water quality standards are really your goals for your waters. They describe things like where you want to get to, what we're going to manage through your programs, how you want to attain them, what you want your water quality to be, that level of protection that you want to give to your waters. And probably the most important function of standards is to provide the regulatory basis for all of the other regulatory programs that Jasmine mentioned. For example, reporting on water quality conditions through your monitoring assessment programs and listing, or to develop water quality-based effluent limits through NPDES permits. You know, and those standards drive those management actions, you know, really beyond just those pollution control technologies that may regulate a specific facility. So, but those things alone aren't everything there is to meeting water quality standards. Next slide. So, water quality standards, as I said, are really the core of the management programs for that establish all of your water quality goals, and they provide that regulatory basis for controls. So really authorized tribes, states, territories adopt water quality standards. The purpose is really to protect public health, welfare, enhance the quality of the water, and serve the purposes of the Act. Kind of to go back to one of the things Jasmine mentioned, you know, the history of the Clean Water Act. You know, it was originally created in '65. It was amended in '72 to the current version that's considered, you know, the modern Clean Water Act. But, you know, she mentioned specifically the regulation. Statutes don't mean much unless you have implementing regulations. The original regulation was promulgated in 1983, and the most recent update was in 2015. But that current regulation implements standards, requirements in the Federal Register. It's in Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR, and in particular, Part 131 and Part 132. Those regulations contain the requirements and procedures for developing, revising, and approving state and tribal water quality standards and EPA's authority to promulgate standards. So while states and tribes and territories, you know, you're really in the driver's seat here. You really control your standards program. EPA has an oversight function because we have that authority to approve or disapprove. But and every standard since 2000, those new and revised standards have to be approved by EPA to be effective under the Clean Water Act. So authorized tribes, states, territories, you all have discretion to go above and beyond what the minimum EPA regulatory requirements are. And EPA's regulation, I think I probably should go back to one of the definitions here. EPA's regulations refer to state. Well, that definition, 40 CFR 131.3, it includes authorized tribes. So that term means tribes with TAS as well as territories. Next slide, please. You can see there's 5.
Mike, can you hear me?
I can. Sounds like we've
Okay.
lost Russell here.
Yes, we have lost Russell. I'm getting the low bandwidth.
Okay.
This is Diane. I'll jump in.
Okay.
So as of April 2021, 73 tribes have TAS for the Water Quality Standards Program, the most running of any EPA's regulatory programs. 45 of those tribes now have EPA-approved tribal standards. Most of the rest are in the process of developing standards. Before EPA set up the TAS process, EPA promulgated federal water quality standards for the Colville Reservation, which is not included in the above totals. The Colville tribe, incidentally, received TAS approval recently and is now in the process of developing tribal standards for EPA to approve. Several of the above tribes are also in the process of going through TAS, or several more tribes are in the process of going through a TAS submission and approval process. So while progress is being made, there's still a gap in Clean Water Act coverage for tribal lands. Next slide, please. Now that we know the regulatory framework for water quality standards, what do water quality standards look like? Water quality standards consist of 3 core components, which tribal water quality standards must contain. These 3 components are created with the 101A and 101A2 Clean Water Act goals in mind to 1, restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters, and wherever attainable, achieve a level of water quality that provides for protection, propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and for recreation in and on the water. First, we need to define the goals for the water body. Otherwise, we wouldn't know what levels of pollutant would be protective. Authorized tribes do this by designating uses. Second, we need to define how to protect the designated uses by describing limits for pollutants that would prevent attainment of those uses. Authorized tribes do this by assigning criteria to protect designated uses. Third, authorized tribes have structures for additional protections for existing water quality and high quality waters under the anti-degradation requirements. Each authorized tribe with water quality standards has included these 3 required components in the standards. They may choose to include additional components as well. While the additional components are not required to be included in standards, to the extent that they are included, EPA has authority to approve or disapprove, just as for the core components of standards. And I'm going to turn it back to Russell, who I think is online. Or back. Nope, he was there and now he's
And I
gone.
actually don't see him at all on the panelist list.
He
Okay.
says he's trying to connect, so we might give him
Okay.
a little bit more.
Okay, I'll keep going.
Yeah.
Here is a schematic of the 3 main components of water quality standards and how they work together and then get implemented through other Clean Water Act programs. Let's start on the left hand with water quality standards. An authorized tribe's water quality standards are made up of the three basic components: uses, criteria, and anti-degradation regulations, all of which will be discussed later in the next few slides. After the vertical line, we have implementation of the standards through on-the-ground programs. Permit limit is a limitation on the pollutants that can be discharged into a water body. It's set by the NPDES permitting authority. Permit limits must derive from and comply with water quality standards. Permit writers need to look at the criteria to ensure the permit limits will comply with standards. Once the permit with pollutant limits is issued, it is enforceable with fines and penalties on the discharger. Two other ways that water quality standards come into play is through Section 401 certification of federally licensed or permitted activities and through total maximum daily loads or TMDLs. Authorized tribes may also have their own specific mechanisms to implement water quality standards in addition to the NPDES or TMDL implementation tools. That's the basic system on how water quality standards fit in programs that implement them. The first component of water quality standards is designated uses. Designated uses describe the desired condition of a water body and can be aspirational. They do not have to be attained right now. They could be a goal for the future. Note that while designated uses should be considered a tool to help communicate a state or tribe's water quality goals to the public, designated uses are typically narrative and can be described in ways that people can easily visualize. Clean Water Act, Section 303 C2A states that states and authorized tribes must establish uses for their waters, taking into consideration their use and value for propagation of fish and wildlife, recreational purposes, public drinking water supplies, agriculture, industrial cooling, and other purposes, including navigation. Section 101A2 of the Clean Water Act specifies it is a national goal, and water quality provides for protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water. These are commonly expressed as the fishable, swimmable goals of the Clean Water Act, or the uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act. The phrase protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife is often shorthanded to aquatic life. This includes protection of aquatic life directly, as well as protection of human health when consuming aquatic life. EPA has made this statement publicly in a number of places, most recently in the preamble to the 40 CFR Part 131 revisions in 2015. The phrase recreation in and on the water is often shorthanded to primary contact recreation. Note that while Congress has put on a higher bar for those uses specified in the Clean Water Act 101A2 than other uses mentioned in the Clean Water Act, unless demonstrated to be unattainable, effectively creating a rebuttable presumption. 101A2 uses, on the other hand, do not have to be designated, but must be considered. It is important to note that use designations aren't automatic. The state or authorized tribe has to specifically designate the uses to express their goals. If they don't designate a use, there is no default. You cannot designate a use of a water BUS for waste transport or assimilation. That is specifically prohibited by the Clean Water Act. Any sign of Russell? Nope. Okay. Authorized tribes must identify designated uses to express their goals. There are no federal defaults to automatically apply if an authorized tribe fails to do so. Authorized tribes have discretion in designated uses. They do not need to be constrained by the wording or the use categories articulated in the Clean Water Act, but can come up with their own uses or categories of uses. Not all authorized tribes have the same designated use categories. For example, some may say recreation or water contact recreation or whole body contact recreation, while others may say Class 1 waters or Class A waters. Authorized tribes can and usually do designate multiple uses for each water body. Because waters are connected, EPA's Water Quality Standards regulation and NPDES regulations also require consideration of downstream protection.
Diane
back
Russell's
on.
back.
Okay,
We can hear you,
Unless you want
Russell.
to keep going.
no, go ahead, Russell.
All right, well, hopefully it won't crash again. All right, so which slide are we on? Here we go.
27.
Type A and type B, all right. All right, the creation of the use classification system is really the tribe's choice. Their EPA really doesn't have any specific recommendation for the way of classifying waters. You know, those basic uses mentioned in the Clean Water Act, you know, really should be reflected in your classification system. If you look here, you know, under, you know, the slide shows a couple of examples of approaches that tribes can take in designated uses. So there are ways that tribes can designate their waters either as a designated use system or you know, that specifically designates multiple uses for each water, like the example on for Tribe A on the left side of the slide, or a classification system that designates an entire class that contains, you know, multiple different uses within that system, like the example on side B. But really, all the Region 6 states and tribes really use the approach that's on the left side of the slide. They have established separate classes of uses. But, you know, again, you know, authorized tribes, I mean, that discretion is yours in designating uses. But you don't really need to be constrained really by the wording that's in the categories that are described in the Clean Water Act. I mean, you can come up with your own categories. And not all authorized tribes have the same types of categories. You know, there may be different ways of doing it. And in addition to those 101A2 protections for propagation and recreation goals, you know, some tribes have used rather unique approaches in their water quality standards. For example, the Lac du Flambeau Chippewa, they have standards that are specific to fishing, hunting and gathering, as well as ceremonial and cultural purposes. So the tribes can include protections for fish and wildlife and aquatic life uses, ceremonial uses, and slides out over here, and other uses, so long as you're supporting the approaches that are outlined in 101A2 of the Act. And there are others that have some, well, actually, Lac du Flambeau has another one. They include wild rice as a protection, because that's really an important food source for the tribe. And another example is the Miccosukee. They include frogging and airboat use in their water quality standards. Next slide. And revising designated uses. Although designated uses can be goals, I mean, states and authorized tribes may want to use their designated uses and associated criteria where, you know, you may find that there are times that those are just not attainable. So while there are certain circumstances where a use can't be removed, the Clean Water Act provides circumstances where a designated use can be removed in a water body. And designated uses can be revised to reflect, you know, a more specific desired condition, like revising a general aquatic life use to something more specific, like a cold water or warm water aquatic life use, or a clearer articulation for a recreation use, like you may specify primary contact or secondary contact, or, you know, a ceremonial use. But in refining designated uses, you know, lead to really more effective criteria and permits and TMDLs, how you manage those waters. So the rationale needed really depends on the use that you want to revise. But for all designated use revisions, you know, the Clean Water Act regulations require that an evaluation of the use and value of that water be made. And the Clean Water Act, you know, allows, through the regulation, the development of a use attainability analysis, or a UAA. And a UAA is really a structured scientific assessment that examines the physical, chemical, and biological factors that are affecting attainment of the use. And we'll talk about that more in detail in the next slide. So again, the UAA is that scientific assessment. You're looking at physical, chemical, and biological, and even economic factors that may affect the attainment of the use. And UAAs really provide the rationale when you're adopting a revised 101A2 use. But when you do that, when you develop that UAA to change a use, EPA doesn't specifically act on that UAA, but actually the standards change that you make based on and supported by that UAA. So when EPA is considering, a designated use change that's specified, in section 101A2 or a subcategory of that use, we look at that UAA as connecting the need for the use change compared to one of the 6 factors in the federal regulations at 131.10G. And those factors include natural. Mike, why don't you go ahead and go to the next slide here? That might make it let everybody see what those 10G factors are. But you can see that some of these factors include natural and non-natural reasons why designated use or is not obtainable. And but after completing a UAA, the state or authorized tribe, you have to adopt what is called the highest attainable use, and the criteria to protect that highest attainable use. And that highest attainable use is really kind of described as, the best level that you can get to in a water body, and that's still attainable. But so you really can't remove, an entire category of use where there's some level of that use that's still feasible to be attained, or adopt a use that has less than the highest attainable use, because otherwise that really circumvents the purposes of the Act and would be inconsistent with the Act. So that highest attainable use is defined in the standards regulation as the modified aquatic life or recreation use that is both closest to the specified use in 101A2 of the Act and is attainable based on the evidence in the factors of 131.10G that preclude attainment of the use and any information or analysis that was used to determine usability. But it's important to note that although a UAA is not required to remove a non-101A2 use, they're really, the structure of that analysis is really useful to support the removal of that use. And even if you don't do a UAA for a non-101A2 use, you're still obligated to determine what the use and value, make a use and value determination for that. And on those factors, if at least one of these factors have to be met. So some of the factors, like I said, the natural issues like the number 1 and 2 there, or natural issues like number 4, that's a man-made structure. And some factors really address both, like number 3, where some man-made factor may cause more damage. Next slide. All right. The standards regulation, talk about, where a UAA is required. And at 40 CFR 131.10J, it says that states must conduct a UAA when you wish to remove a designated use that's reflected in one of those 101A2 uses, or to remove a subcategory of a 101A2 use, or to designate a subcategory of use that requires less stringent criteria. But really the opposite occurs in 131.10K. It says that a UAA is not required when you're designating a use that is specified in the Clean Water Act for the first time, and when designating a subcategory of 101A2 use that requires criteria that's at least as stringent that was previously applicable. And before removing a non-101A2 use, like I said just a second ago, you have to, you can use a UAA or make a use and value demonstration. I think that should do it. Any questions?
I am looking now. Nope, you're good to move forward.
Great, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Russell. All right, we will now turn it over to Diane, who admirably filled in for Russell while he was having some trouble there. So we'll turn it over to Diane Evans for water quality criteria.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. So the second core component of the Water Quality Standards Program is water quality criteria. Water quality criteria are limits on a particular pollutant or limits on a condition of a water body designed to protect and support a designated use. 40 CFR 131.3 says that when criteria are met, water quality will protect the designated use. So when the appropriate criteria are selected for a particular water body, and when water quality in that water body meets all of the criteria, the designated use should be protected. Authorized tribes adopt water quality criteria as part of their water quality standards. They consider which criteria are needed to protect the designated use and then incorporate these criteria into their water quality standards. The Clean Water Act requirements for criteria are in two specific places. Clean Water Act Section 303C1 requires states and authorized tribes to adopt criteria to protect designated uses into their water quality standards. That's the general requirement. There's also a more specific requirement for a list of over 100 pollutants that states and authorized tribes shall adopt for those pollutants in their water quality standards. These are called priority pollutants or toxic pollutants, and the list was generated based on litigation that resulted in this list of those pollutants. The list is based on legal and policy decisions, I believe back in the 1980s, and contains many legacy pollutants such as DDT. The Water Quality Standards and Regulation gives more details to implement the Clean Water Act requirements that pertain to criteria. One, criteria must be based on sound scientific rationale. EPA produces national water quality recommendations under Section 304A of the Clean Water Act. These criteria recommendations are often used as a basis for tribal water quality standards. However, the regulation also allows authorized tribes to develop its own criteria or make site-specific modifications to EPA's recommendations. The 304A criteria are scientific recommendations and are not federal rules. States and authorized tribes may not consider other factors such as technological feasibility, social or economic costs, and the benefits of achieving criteria levels in criteria development. Criteria may be revised from time to time as new scientific data or methodologies are developed. Criteria must contain sufficient parameters to protect the designated uses. This means that a state or tribe should make sure that the parameters relevant to the designated uses of the water are considered. For example, if the use is human recreation, but the only criteria for that use are for nitrogen and phosphorus, you're missing something. You need criteria for bacteria to help protect people from recreating in the water from getting gastrointestinal illnesses. For waters with multiple designated uses, the criteria shall support the most sensitive use. Most waters have more than one designated use. Criteria for parameter can depend on the use. For example, aquatic life are less sensitive to something like dieldrin, which is a pesticide, than humans are, if humans were to eat the fish from the water. So if you have both aquatic life and shellfish harvesting uses, you want to implement the criteria which will protect both uses. It's not always one particular use that's the most sensitive. It could be that aquatic life is more sensitive to one pollutant, while human health is the more sensitive to another. EPA encourages authorized tribes, states, and territories to reach out to local communities and learn how they use the water body. This information will help you to protect more, or help you make more informed decisions that support the most sensitive use. EPA's water quality standards regulation allows for both numeric and narrative criteria. While states and authorized tribes will often use EPA's 304A criteria recommendations when adopting state or tribal standards, it is important to recognize that the regulations provide multiple options for establishing criteria. 40 CFR 131.11b states that authorized tribes should establish numeric criteria based on 1. EPA's National 304A criteria recommendations. These are developed by EPA based on latest scientific knowledge. These recommendations are periodically issued as guidance to states and tribes for use in developing their own criteria. 304A is a section of the Clean Water Act that directed EPA to develop these regulations. States and authorized tribes can also modify 304A recommended values to reflect site-specific conditions, or they can use other scientifically definable methods. The Clean Water Act Water Quality Standards Regulation also allows for narrative criteria where numeric criteria cannot be established, or to supplement numeric criteria. Both forms of criteria provide a regulatory basis for implementation and management actions like NPDES permit limits, water quality assessments, and TMDL development. Folks are generally familiar with numeric criteria, but let's look for a moment at an example of a narrative criteria so you'll know what I'm referring to. Narrative criteria exist in all water quality standards and often include the term free from, like this example. Another common example is no toxics and toxic amounts. Narrative criteria provide a qualitative benchmark for assessing water quality. They are useful as indicators of water quality where numeric criterion is either not available or cannot be applied. For example, when a particular pollutant or water condition cannot be precisely measured. EPA's view is that effective tribal water quality standards should include both numeric and narrative criteria. The use of both ensures that a water is fully protected for both chemical-specific effects and the synergistic effects of mixtures of chemicals or other less measurable pollutants, such as floatable debris or objectionable deposits. When there are no numeric criteria or 304A recommendation for a particular pollutant that may be present, narrative criteria are often used to protect designated uses. EPA's water quality recommendations and the Clean Water Act include various types of water quality criteria. Each type has a specific protective focus. Aquatic life criteria protect aquatic life from specific chemical pollutants in the water column, in addition to typical surface waters. Biological criteria describe the desired biological condition of a water body, using, for example, a fish index, macroinvertebrates, or a diatom index. Human health criteria protect humans from specific chemical pollutants in both water and fish tissue. Recreational criteria protect humans from uses like primary contact recreation or swimming. Nutrient criteria protect aquatic life and source waters for public water supply and/or recreation. Other types of criteria may also be included in water quality standards. Because of their different protective focuses, these different types of water quality criteria are complementary. Since there's no single number that will guarantee protection of all forms of life, usually all categories of water quality criteria are considered when setting standards and evaluating the condition of a water body. If any water quality criterion is exceeded, there may be a potential risk to some portion of the intricate web of human, animal, and plant life connected with a water body. The different types of water quality criteria collectively provide a valuable tool for setting water quality standards and making water quality management decisions that help protect the broad diversity of life affected by water pollutants. Let's look at aquatic life criteria. Aquatic life criteria are designed to protect all aquatic organisms, including both animals and plants. In addition to typical surface waters, EPA recommendations are largely applicable to wetlands, but some may need adjustments, for example, because of natural factors like pH. Each aquatic life criterion refers to a particular concentration of a particular parameter in an ambient water. An aquatic life criterion typically includes three components. The first is a concentration and magnitude, such as how much of a parameter can be present. And this is, what we refer to as like micrograms per liter. Another component is a period of time or duration over which the in-stream concentration is averaged. For example, how long? And then the third component is frequency, indicating how often the average concentration could be exceeded, like how often. An example for zinc and saltwater is included in this slide. An aquatic life criterion would contain something like a 4-day average designed to protect against chronic, which is extended exposure to lower concentration. It would also include a 1-hour average designed to protect against acute short-term exposures to higher concentrations. So where data allow, there can be 4 separate aquatic life criterion for a particular chemical: saltwater, acute and chronic, and freshwater, acute and chronic. There are cases where we don't have one or the other. For example, a chemical that is highly bioaccumulative probably doesn't need an acute value, such as the chronic endpoint is far more sensitive. In some cases, the aquatic life criteria developed by EPA may be more stringent than necessary or not protective enough for a specific water body. This depends on such factors on whether the species at the site are more or less sensitive than those used to develop the national criteria recommendations, and on whether the particular physical and chemical characteristics of the site alter the biological availability or toxicity of a chemical. In such cases, a site-specific criteria can be developed based on toxicity data for more appropriate species or water conditions at the site. That's another topic for another day. Biological criteria are based on the premise that the structure and function of aquatic life or aquatic biological community within a specific type of water body provide critical information about the quality of surface waters. Biological criteria are threshold levels or guidelines that describe the desired biological integrity of aquatic communities of surface waters. For example, biological criteria may refer to a relatively simple indices such as the number of different species present in a given area or the number of individuals of a given species, or to more complex properties such as food webs or the efficiency of nutrient cycling in the water body. Biological criteria can help identify water quality degradation that cannot be identified by chemical or physical test procedures alone. Followed by a stressor identification evaluation, biological criteria can initiate the process to identify and address the causes of water quality degradation. Biological criteria are developed by the tribe to reflect local conditions and the desired use classification system of a water body. The biological criteria must protect the designated use of the water body and the propagation of wildlife, fish, and shellfish. Different criteria are developed for different designated uses. Biological criteria may be numeric or narrative expressions that describe the desired biological integrity of aquatic communities inhabiting the waters of a given use category. Narrative biological criteria are general statements or attainable or attained conditions of biological integrity or water quality for a given designated use or designation. Numeric criteria are specific quantitative indicators of that condition. You can see examples of both narrative and numeric criteria on this slide. Most water quality standards also include human health criteria, which focus on protecting humans over their lifetime from chronic exposure to pollutants. This is about protecting people, not just from developing acute immediate illness following swimming, but from things such as developing cancer from lifetime exposure to carcinogen, a chemical in water. A human health criteria is the highest concentration of pollutant in water that is not expected to pose a significant risk to human health. Exceeding a criteria does not necessarily mean there is or will be an environmental effect, only that there is a potential for one. EPA publishes human health recommendations for the effects of pollutants from ingestion of aquatic organisms such as fish and from ingestion of water and fish. Human health criteria are designed to protect human health under average conditions of exposure and do not take into account local water quality conditions, or they do not take into account potential reactions between chemical of concern and other chemicals that could increase or reduce the toxicity of the chemical of concern. This is a simplified version of the equation used to develop protective human health criteria. The toxicity factors will depend on whether the pollutant is a carcinogen or not, but generally human health criteria factor in average adult weight, water intake, fish consumption, and bioaccumulation of the pollutant. All these factors can be varied in criteria derivation depending on the situations of an individual tribe and its members. To determine how much of a pollutant to allow in a water where the pollutant can accumulate in fish that are caught, the tribe needs to know typically how much fish people eat per day. This is commonly referred to as the fish consumption rate, or FCR, which is an abbreviation. This factor is highlighted in the red box on the slide. Through various scientific studies, EPA has found that the average person in the U.S. eats 22 grams of fish per day. So in developing EPA's national recommended criteria, EPA assumes that the national default rate for the general population is 22 grams per day. That's about, I think, 4 to 5 meals a month of fish. EPA also has found that the average default fish consumption rate for subsistence fishers is 142 grams per day. Authorized tribes developing their own water quality standards can specify the fish consumption rate used in their human health criteria. The Spokane tribe, when setting their own Clean Water Act effective water quality standards, used a fish consumption rate of 865 grams per day based on anthropological data. The tribe's estimates of the fish consumption rate for traditional subsistence lifestyles were based on several factors, including open peer-reviewed literature, ethnographic documents and reports concerning traditional lifestyles and practices, confirmatory statements from tribally recognized cultural experts whose expertise derives from their traditional environmental knowledge. This slide demonstrates just how much varying the fish consumption rate can affect the ultimately derived protective water quality criteria. And you see a big range in values, all depending on the fish consumption rate used to develop the criteria. States and tribes adopt recreational criteria to protect humans from illness or organ damage during recreational activities in the water, such as swimming, surfing, kayaking, or ceremonial activities. Recreational criteria are designed to protect people from illnesses, including gastrointestinal effects or effects to skin, eyes, ears due to exposure to fecal contamination in the water. Recreational criteria also include criteria to protect from kidney or liver damage due to exposure to certain cyanotoxins. For fecal contamination, EPA has published criteria recommendations based on epidemiological studies involving swimmers looking at an association between water quality and illness. Examples of 2 different types of recreational criteria are shown on this slide. I won't read them for you, but you can see that much like aquatic life criteria, there are elements of magnitude or concentration and time, which are the duration and frequency components. Much of the water quality degradation around the country has been linked to nutrient over-enrichment. For example, hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, harmful algal blooms in numerous water bodies, and fisheries degradation in Chesapeake Bay. Authorized tribes and states adopt nutrient criteria to protect both aquatic life and human uses of the water. Nutrient criteria are numeric limits of total nitrogen and total phosphorus that protect designated uses, including aquatic life, recreation, and public water supply from the effects of eutrophication. Nutrient criteria are developed for different water body types using field data of nutrient concentrations. We refer to those as stressors, and different ecological effects symptomatic of eutrophication. We call those the responses. Next slide, please. Please remember that as single water body may have different designated uses and that each use will have different criteria. This sometimes results in different numeric criteria for the exact same parameter. For example, a lake that's a drinking water source may have one concentration requirement for nitrate to protect drinking water and another much lower concentration for nitrate because the lake also supports aquatic life. When there are two separate values for the same numeric criteria, the most protective criteria for the most sensitive use is the one you would have to meet in a permit limit or an assessment. That ensures that all designated uses are supported. And now that we've introduced criteria, I'll turn it back to Chelsea and Mike to facilitate a short question and answer session.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Diane. And looking in the chat box that I have in front of me, there was one question from Tammy asking if ceremonial use is considered recreational.
That's an excellent question. It's not automatically considered recreational use, but because the form of or the route of exposure is often the same from swimming or can be the same from swimming, adjusting water. Many tribes have used this recreational criteria as criteria to support the ceremonial use. And then also some tribes have combined ceremonial and recreational uses into the same designated use and called that primary contact in their standards, and then just designated that use for all water bodies. So they were covered in the standards and did not specify which water bodies had ceremonial uses and which did not.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And Chelsea, if you have something else that I don't see on my chat box.
Yes, it looks like it's not a question and more of a comment from Vivian. It says that it's heartbreaking. I'm afraid our river body may only be able to strive for protection of human health due to its toxicity and proximity to major polluters. So it just looks like it's a comment, not really a question.
Okay, thank you for the comment. And, you know, we'd be happy to talk in a phone call later this week or whenever you're available, Vivian, and we can look more at that particular situation.
That's all I have on my end, Mike.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we will now move on to our next session. It's Forrest John going to discuss anti-degradation and then some of the other components of standards. Forrest, you there?
Mike, I am. Can you hear me?
I can.
Great. Yes, my name is Forrest John, and good morning. So far we've talked about designated use and the associated criteria. So next is anti-degradation, which is a third core element of water quality standards, as we find in Section 40 CFR 131.12. The purpose of anti-degradation is to provide a framework to implement the Clean Water Act requirements to maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Section 131.12 describes that states and authorized tribes shall develop and adopt anti-degradation policy that is legally binding. That policy provides additional protection for waters of the U.S. beyond designated uses and criteria, which we just talked about. The regulation also requires that they shall also develop anti-degradation implementation methods. Those may or may not be legally binding, but must be available to the public and subject to public involvement. The line between anti-degradation policy and implementation methods isn't always clear. At a minimum, to be consistent with a federal regulation, the elements specified in 40 CFR 131.12a must be addressed in legally binding language somewhere in a state or tribal regulation. Let's talk about the policy first, and then after that, we'll talk about the implementation methods. States and authorized tribes must develop and adopt a statewide anti-degradation policy that includes 4 elements. 1, protection of existing uses for all waters of the U.S. 2, protection of high-quality waters, and those waters are water quality that exceed the levels necessary to support protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife and recreation in and on the waters. 3rd, protection for outstanding natural resource waters, or what we oftentimes call ONRWs, identified by the state or tribe. And lastly, number 4, compliance with Clean Water Act Section 316 in regard to thermal discharges. Section 316 pertains to really, these are power plants for intake and discharge of their cooling water. Next slide, Mike. Thanks. People often refer to anti-degradation as having 3 tiers of protection, like stair steps, as you see on the slide. All waters have at least Tier 1 protection, while some waters have Tier 2 or Tier 3 protection as well. The higher the number, the more stringent the protection. I will now explain what protection each of the 3 tiers includes. Tier 1 protection requires the maintenance and protection of existing uses. And of course, we've already talked about existing uses. And 40 CFR 131.3e defines existing uses as, quote, those uses actually attained in the water body on or after November 28, 1975, whether or not they are included in the water quality standards. Tier 1 protection applies to all waters of the U.S. This means that waters receiving Tier 2 or 3 protection receive Tier 1 protection in addition to either Tier 2 or Tier 3 protection. Next slide, please. The regulation language for Tier 2 protection can be found at 40 CFR 131.12e2. As is somewhat complex, the slide summarizes the main point here, along with defining which waters will be protected and how. The regulation also lays out the requirements of a Tier 2 review. Essentially, a Tier 2 review is a decision-making process for what to do with high quality where it exists. That is, water quality better than necessary to support Clean Water Act 101A2 uses. And remember, 101A2 uses is the fishable, swimmable goal. The regulation says that high quality shall be maintained and protected unless a finding is made that, 1, use of the assimilative capacity is necessary to accommodate important economic or social development in the area in which the waters are located, and 2, if this is the case, in order to allow the lowering, there must be a Tier 2 review, including public participation to demonstrate these circumstances are met. Tier 3 protection is for, quote, outstanding natural resource waters, or ONRWs. And by the way, states and tribes call them different things, but they still fall under those ONRW or Tier 3 framework. States and authorized tribes must ensure that the water quality of such waters is maintained and protected. It's important to note that although the regulation provides some suggestions as to the type of waters that could be considered for Tier 2 protection, it is up to the state or tribe to identify their Tier 3 waters themselves. EPA does not identify Tier 3 waters for states or tribes. A state or tribe can classify any water body as an ONRW. These often include, 1, waters that are reviewed as pristine, highly valued waters, important to recreation or tourism, or lastly, waters of exceptional biological significance, important, unique, or sensitive ecologically. It is important to note that a water body does not have to be pristine or high quality in order for a state or tribe to identify the water as an ONRW. For example, a water could be an exceptional ecological significance but not yet be of a sufficient water quality, thus warranting stringent protection to help maintain and restore the water body. And then lastly, Tier 3 protection is the most protective of all 3 tiers of anti-degradation. Because it does not allow any degradation. However, some states and tribes choose to allow an exception for temporary or short-term degradation, to which EPA has established national policy that such temporary degradation can only be consistent with regulation if it occurs for weeks or months, not years. This could allow for activities such as restoration projects that will ultimately restore or protect water quality, but will cause disruption in the short term. Some states have created a Tier 2.5 or Tier 1.5 category to provide more restrictive protection than Tier 2. It's kind of between the Tier 2 and 3, without the no degradation restriction of Tier 3. This looks different in different states and tribes and is at their discretion since it is not described in EPA's national regulation. When reviewing such provisions, EPA could act based on whether such provisions and decisions are consistent with Tier 2 requirements, as we find in 40 CFR 131.12A2. Next slide. We just talked about the basic elements that an authorized tribe's policy must address. What about those implementation methods? Authorized tribes must develop implementation methods that describe how the policy will be applied. The methods must be consistent with and address all components of the tribe's policy and EPA regulation. 3 tiers of protection, the components of Tier 2 review, and Clean Water Act Section 316 compliance for thermal discharges. And remember, 316 in the Clean Water Act deals with power plants. The methods must be publicly available. The tribe must provide an opportunity for public involvement during the development and revisions of implementation methods. Please note that doesn't mean necessarily a public hearing, but there should be documentation of what the public involvement was. And then in addition, methods may provide additional details that explain how the state tribe's policy will be implemented. The methods can be adopted as water quality standards provisions, which are binding, incorporated by reference, which are binding, or written as guidance documents, which would be non-binding. While this may seem a lot to address, EPA has developed a model tribal water quality standard template, which we'll describe in more detail later in the presentation. That is accessible on our website and blah, blah, blah. And then Mike, last slide. Section 131.13 through 15 of the standards regulation allow authorized tribes to adopt additional policies affecting the application and implementation of water quality standards, such as mixing zone policies, low flow policies, water quality standards variance policies, water quality standards variance themselves, and provisions authorizing the use of compliance schedules for water quality-based effluent limits and NPDES permits. These policies are not required elements in authorized tribal standards, but if they are included, they are subject to EPA review and approval as standards. Again, use of EPA model tribal standards templates provides language for tribes to consider when deciding whether or not to adopt language regarding mixing zone policies and water quality standards and variances. So just in conclusion, I just might want to mention, to me, anti-DEG has always been abstract to me, but when I see it written in tribes or state standards, it makes a lot more sense. So looking at the model that EPA has developed for tribes, or even looking at other tribal anti-DEG policies and implementation, I think would really help further understand it. And with that, I'm done.
All right, great. Thanks, Forrest. And I don't see any questions in my chat box here. Chelsea?
I also do not see any questions in my chat box.
Okay. Well, we will await the end of the presentation, and if things come to mind along the way, please feel free to chime in. So with that, we will move forward then back to Diane Evans to talk about the roles of tribes, states, and territories in the water quality standards setting process.
Okay, thanks, Mike. States, authorized tribes, and territories do the heavy lifting in the Water Quality Standards Program. They determine the designated uses, adopt protective criteria and uses, adopt anti-degradation and implementation procedures. When a tribe adopts new or revised water quality standards, it is required under Section 303C of the Clean Water Act to submit the standards to EPA for review, and then EPA either approves or disapproves the standards. At least once every 3 years, a state or tribe should hold a public hearing for the purpose of reviewing applicable standards and modify and adopt new or revised standards where appropriate. This is often called the triennial review. The responsibility for water quality standards is given to the states by statute, the Clean Water Act, Section 303C, and states have no option but to participate in the program. Indian tribes, however, may or may not choose, or may choose to assume or not assume responsibility for administering the water quality standards program at their discretion. If you have questions about applying for TAS for the water quality standards, please contact Randy G., Alexa Olson, Tina Alvarado, or me, Diane Evans. A few tribes have chosen to seek TAS for a portion of the water bodies within the reservation rather than all waters if boundary issues are still being worked through. Tribes are also able to submit supplemental TAS applications following the same regulatory requirements to submit the original TAS application for standards if they decide to include additional waters at a later date as tribal lands are expanded. Tribes who apply for TAS under the Water Quality Standards Program often apply for TAS for the 401 program at the same time. TAS may then be approved for both programs consistent with EPA's Water Quality Standards regulation. After being adopted into a tribe's regulations, an authorized tribe will submit its standards to EPA for review under Clean Water Act Section 303C. An authorized tribe's water quality standards submittal should include several things. First, the new or revised water quality standards. These could be revised uses, criteria, and anti-degradation for all waters at the tribe at once, or just a few specific changes, or water quality standards for a specific water body. Whatever the revisions are, those should be clearly identified within the new or revised water quality standards. Another element of the submittal is supporting information regarding the revisions. For example, if a designated use is revised to something less than a Clean Water Act 101A2 use, that's fishable, swimmable, you would need to submit a UAA supporting that downgrade. The UAA isn't necessarily something EPA would approve or disapprove, but we would review the UAA to determine whether it supported the regulation revision to the designated use. Submittal should also include certification that the standards were duly adopted according to tribal law. This is often referred to as Attorney General Certification, or AG Cert for shorthand. And finally, a submittal should include documentation of a public participation process for the water quality standards revision. EPA's regulation at 40 CFR 131.20B, as revised in 2015, makes it clear that states and authorized tribes must conduct a public hearing on all new and revised water quality standards consistent with the federal regulation at 40 CFR Part 25.5. In other words, authorized tribes and states must comply with EPA's public participation requirements when administering water quality standards programs under the Clean Water Act. This means that tribes and states must hold well-publicized public hearings consistent with 40 CFR Part 25 when adopting the initial water quality standards, among other things. We have examples of public notices, mailing lists, and other documents to help with the public participation process. Any revision or review of water quality standards must be subject to public hearing, but it's not limited to that. EPA encourages authorized tribes, states, and territories to reach out to local communities and learn how they use the water body and keep those communities informed of any water quality standards issues that could impact the water bodies. By engaging early and often, water quality standards will best reflect the variables and needs of a local community, which will benefit the public and implementing agency alike. Community members should be engaged meaningfully through the decision-making process through public meetings, webinars, and public hearings as appropriate. Please keep in mind that each community has unique considerations and outreach should be tailored to meet those needs. Next slide, please. EPA has developed tools to assist tribes with TAS applications and water quality standards development. On the website noted on this slide, we have several options that can be used. The first is a streamlined TAS application that outlines the requirements for eligibility and identifies places where applicable applicants can refer to previously approved TAS applications, such as a TAS application for the Clean Water Act 106 program. The website also includes a water quality standards template that provides example language that tribes can use as a possible starting point for developing water quality standards. And then the website also includes a human health criteria that produces a table of numeric criteria using specified fish consumption rates and cancer risk level. Please note that the streamlined TAS application on EPA's website does not address the separate prerequisite of Section 102.11b of the Safe, Accountable, Flexible, Efficient Transportation Equity Act of 2005, also known as SAFE-T, which is required in Oklahoma. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. EPA serves several roles in the Water Quality Standards Program. For one, it facilitates development of regulations and policies that guides EPA review of water quality standards submitted by states, territories, and authorized tribes. EPA also coordinates with and provides technical assistance to the same states, authorized tribes, and territories. And then EPA develops and publishes National Clean Water Act 304A criteria recommendations based on the latest science. The EPA administrator has delegated the authority to approve or disapprove water quality standards in the Clean Water Act to the EPA regional administrators. In Region 6, it is further delegated to the Water Division Director. The Clean Water Act sets out a statutory timeframe for action, 60 days to approve or 90 days to disapprove. However, water quality standards do not become legally binding or usable for Clean Water Act purposes until EPA approves them. Once the EPA approves new and revised water quality standards, they can become effective for Clean Water Act purposes. EPA's basis for review and approval or disapproval is whether the submitted standards are consistent with the Clean Water Act and the Federal Water Quality Standards Regulation. While EPA reviews tribal standards to ensure that they meet minimum requirements and the intent of the Clean Water Act, EPA does not have the authority to approve or disapprove a state or tribe standards on the grounds that the standards are too stringent. Section 510 of the Clean Water Act recognizes states and tribes' authority to adopt water quality standards that are more stringent than those required by the Act. If EPA disapproves of state or tribe standards, EPA provides an opportunity for the state or tribe to revise the standards. As specified in the Clean Water Act, if a state or tribe does not adopt revised standards within 90 days of EPA's disapproval, the EPA administrator should promptly propose and promulgate replacement federal standards. That does not happen very often. One way to think about the difference between water quality standards and implementation is that water quality standards are the theoretical basis for several implementation programs. You can think of water quality standards as the theory, plans, or process, which are then implemented through permits to discharge, as this slide shows, or other programs like assessment and 303 delisting of impaired water bodies. Implementation is where the rubber meets the road for water quality protection. What that boils down to is that you set up water quality standards in order to provide the basis for other Clean Water Act programs to work off of. Permits to discharge pollutants through the MPDS program, or to discharge dredge and fill material through the 404 program, need to be structured in order to attain water quality standards. And when you assess whether a water body is impaired or attaining its standards, you will assess the water based on the water quality standards. If you end up developing a TMDL as a means to restore water quality, you use water quality standards to set the target of the TMDL. Before we end, I'll mention a few tools that you may be familiar with or may be hearing about in your future. These are tools that can help achieve water quality standards. We know that many water bodies are impaired or aren't attaining standards in the short term, but under the Clean Water Act framework, we need to work towards achieving water quality standards and adjusting where needed or restoring where needed. Here are a variety of tools that you may encounter, some related to water quality standards themselves and some relating to the implementation programs. So these are simplified in the diagram as the permit limit. In the realm of water quality standards, shown on the left, we have variances and site-specific criteria. I'll tell you a little about these now. A water quality standards variance is a time-limited designated use and criterion for a specific pollutant or water quality parameter that reflects the highest attainable condition during the term of the variance. Unlike use revisions, water quality standards do not change the underlying designated use, and they only apply for the discharges or water bodies and pollutant specified in the variance, and only for a short term or length of time specified in the variance. Water quality standards are a useful tool for when there's uncertainty whether water quality standards can be attained, but you can make incremental improvements over a short time frame or a longer time frame. Water quality standards variances allow time to implement actions, assess the impact of those actions, and then adapt those actions in order to effectively improve water quality. Water quality standards variances are a regulatory mechanism that ensures incremental water quality improvements when the designated use and criterion are not currently attainable. Site-specific criteria are another tool for meeting water quality standards. If you're having trouble meeting the standards in a water body, it is possible that you might not have the right criteria to protect the designated use. Site-specific criteria are best used when you have additional scientific information that can more accurately express a level for a water quality parameter to protect the designated use based on the water body's specific physical, chemical, and biological characteristics. Under Section 131.11b1 of the Water Quality Standards Regulation, states and tribes may adopt numeric criteria based on published 304A guidance, 304A guidance modified to reflect site-specific condition or other scientifically defensible methods. Now I'll mention some tools for achieving water quality standards that are part of the implementation programs. An NPDES permit limit may in some circumstances allow a mixing zone, which is a provision to allow a zone of initial dilution around an outfall of a wastewater treatment plant in which criteria can be exceeded, but the water quality standards of the water body will be met as a whole. The rationale for allowing this in some permits is that sometimes aquatic life can be exposed to pollutant concentrations above a criterion magnitude for a short duration without interfering with the designated use of the water body. The mixing zone provision itself would be contained in the actual NPDES permit, as you see on the right side of the diagram, but the state or tribe's water quality standards would contain a policy about mixing zone, as you see on the left. The policy and the water quality standards would outline the details, such as description of the circumstances in which a mixing zone would or would not be allowed. Another tool that is part of the NPDES program is compliance schedules. If an authorized tribe or state has included the use of NPDES compliance schedules in its water quality standards through an authorizing provision, NPDES permits discharging to waters in the state or tribe may include a permit compliance schedule as appropriate. This would be used when a permittee cannot immediately comply with the permit's water quality-based effluent limits upon the effective date of the NPDES permit. If that is the case, where appropriate, the permit can include a schedule of compliance that grants time to the permittee to take additional actions needed to meet the limits. This could include adding treatment capabilities to the wastewater treatment plant or possibly an expansion of the wastewater treatment plant. The regulation requires that the water quality effluent limits be met as soon as possible. This is often like a 3-year compliance schedule, or it could be shorter than that. A total maximum daily load is another tool to achieve water quality standards. States are required to assess the quality of waters every 2 years, and as part of that assessment, make a list of waters that need a TMDL to meet water quality standards. That's called the 303D list. Waters get put on this list are in the queue to have a TMDL or development of a TMDL, which is a plan on how to get the water to meet water quality standards. A TMDL is a calculation of the maximum pollution that a water body can receive and will meet water quality standard. It includes an allocation of that amount to pollutant sources. These are waste load allocation for point sources like wastewater treatment plants, and it also includes load allocations for non-point sources. A TMDL should be developed for waters not meeting its standard, and the goal of those actions is to reduce, to identify actions taken to reduce the relevant loads, which would then help the water body meet its water quality standards. Enforcement actions are outside of the water quality standards development framework. Enforcement actions are used to resolve violations and support implementation of NPDES permits or 404 permits. Enforcement actions are intended to return a facility or activity to compliance with permit limits and consequently the underlying water quality standards. Please note that EPA's approval of TS applications for water quality standards or do not include any enforcement authority to the tribe under the Clean Water Act. The permitting authority, which is usually EPA or the Corps of Engineers, retains enforcement authority and the Clean Water Act for the permits that those agencies issue. There's no special funding for water quality standards, but development of TS applications and developing water quality standards are allowable uses of Clean Water Act 106 grant programs. There are also grant funds available under EPA's General Assistance Program for Tribes, GAP grants, as we all know, and those are offered through regional offices. The GAP grants do not come from the Clean Water Act, but rather cover all environmental programs administered by EPA. As you can see by now, water quality standards provide the basis for many Clean Water Act programs, and we can think of this as a water quality-based approach. The activities described in this slide, the pie slices, are a sampling of the implementation tools that rely on water quality standards to define a water quality goal that needs to be achieved. Water quality standards are the base or the target for the implementation programs, which is why it's at the center of the wheel. The water quality-based approach emphasizes the overall water quality or quality of water within a water body and provides the mechanism through the amount of pollution entering a water body that is controlled based on the intrinsic conditions of water body and the standards used to protect it. The water quality-based approach is a cyclic process which starts at the center with establishing water quality standards and then goes to either conduct monitoring and assessment or write permits. For example, if you start at write permits at the 7 o'clock wedge, those are written to comply with the underlying water quality standards. Then the state or authorized tribe monitors water quality in a water body to determine if it's meeting water quality standards, and the enforcement agency, EPA or the Corps, monitors the permit. Based on those processes and comparing to water quality standards, a water body may be listed as impaired or identified as not meeting water quality uses or designated uses. If a water body is listed as impaired, it's then slated to receive a total maximum daily load, or TMDL. The TMDL is implemented through integration into permits and then the cycle begins all over again. Beyond public involvement is the development of water quality standards. The implementation of water quality standards also provides opportunities for meaningful community engagement at the state, tribe, and local levels. The arrows on the outside of the pie slices in this diagram refer to this. For instance, the community surrounding a water body can monitor the water quality and provide data and information to the tribe. I hope now that you have a good sense of what water quality standards are and how they are implemented and the roles of various entities in the water quality standards. And I think we're ready for our final question and answer session. And I think we should first go back to the original question from the first section of this presentation, and if Chelsea or Mike could repeat that.
Yeah, I believe it was just whether TAS is required to adopt water quality standards, as I recall. I don't have it in front of me, but I believe that was the nature of the question.
Okay, thank you, Mike. A tribe may choose to adopt water quality standards under tribal authority without applying for TAS. EPA would not be able to approve those standards under the Clean Water Act, but they could be effective under tribal law and implemented under tribal authority for various programs. Later today in the surface water session, starting at 1 o'clock, there's a presentation on the revisions to the 106 guidance. And that guidance document was published, I think, in 2007. And part of that document discusses that, some tribes may choose not to apply for TAS for the Water Quality Standards Program for various reasons, and that they may choose to adopt standards under tribal authority. And so I can't speak on revisions to that guidance, but we have put that framework out in various guidance documents in the past. Chelsea, were there follow-up questions on that particular question from earlier?
No, there's 3 additional questions from the same lady, Vivian, and she actually sent it to all panelists. So if you guys want, you can open it up in your chat box and address those as you see best fit.
Okay. Yeah, Vivian asked a question, what happens if even human health is deemed unattainable? She mentions our life expectancy is 44 years old. We have high incidence of cancer and autoimmune. Our waters and streams are already deemed impaired. So the question is about human health being unattainable.
We'd have to look at the specific water bodies, and Vivian will definitely schedule a call later on to talk more about that. I'm trying to think through the math of human health criteria. There's a lot of science that goes on the risk factors for the doses that go into the human health criteria calculations, which is different than the fish consumption rate. So I'm trying to think about if, whether life expectancy at a shorter, unfortunately shorter time frame, it would be more protective or less protective than the current default factors. I can't think through the math off the top of my head on that. It kind of depends on the pollutant and, whether there's TMDL schedules and whether there are activities that can be controlled through NPDES permit limits, or if it's an on-point source, which is not enforceable under the Clean Water Act. So I think we're going to have just some follow-up conversations on that. There are a lot of water bodies that are impaired for fecal contamination, such as E. coli and other, or enterococci, and it's hard to distinguish between whether that's coming from wildlife or septic tanks, which are an on-point source, or sometimes there is a wastewater treatment plant that does not comply with their limits for bacteria. Most of the time, if a wastewater treatment plant is properly disinfecting their effluent, they have no problem meeting their effluent limitations for wastewater for E. coli or enterococci. But there are, a few out there that are like package plants, and that could be a source of bacteria.
Diane, I would add to that, I think part of her question, goes to, I think you're right in that we would need to talk on the side, but it's important to understand where that discharge originates, whether and who has jurisdiction there. And because I know Vivian mentioned that she's working on a TAS application. So who's in control of those waters will depend on how all those other things you mentioned come into play. Don't you think?
Yes, yeah.
And Vivian, we have your contact info that you provided here, and we'll certainly follow up with you on that.
And I don't see any other questions on my end.
Okay, I don't either. We still have, folks have something here last minute. We've still got 6 minutes till we have to close, but if folks just want to kind of think about it and get back to us later, I had skipped off. I've got our contact info here on the screen. If you want to follow up with any one of us, we'll be happy to talk to you. All right. Well, I guess if there's nothing else, we'll go ahead and close out early and let folks get on to lunch. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everybody's audience for your attention, and thank you, Chelsea, for your help in hosting this as well.
No problem. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Diane, Jasmine, Russell, Mike, Forrest, and Richard. We appreciate you guys for joining us today. And like I said, this is recorded, so it will be located on our YouTube channel. If anyone has any questions after the fact, please feel free to reach out to Karen or I or any of the panelists. And our next session will be starting actually at 1 o'clock with, what is it, Karen? Surface water. So see you guys soon. Have a good lunch.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.